afternoon, everyone. Thanks for returning. So this phase of the meeting is going to take a hard look at the engineering education enterprise, going from PK-12 all the way through graduate studies and alternative career pathways for PhD students. But we're going to go backwards. We're going to start off with a keynote and then start with the graduate preparation for students to take alternative career pathways. We'll continue tomorrow morning with the undergraduate preparation for 21st century careers, followed by diversity, a deep discussion about diversity, and then on to the PK-12 discussion. So looking at this whole landscape and the climate that we're in, I was thinking who would be a great speaker to kick off this multi-session discussion over the rest of today and tomorrow. And furthermore, at the banquet tonight, we're going to have Dr. Aubrey from Northeastern, who's going to talk about the Gordon Prize that the NAE awards each year. So I quickly zoomed in on Joe Helble, who is no stranger to this group. So Dr. Helble was appointed provost of Dartmouth College in May 2018, so a little less than a year. He's got to see higher ed in a new lens. But he was dean of the Dartmouth Thayer School of Engineering for several years, and he brought national prominence to what Dartmouth was doing in engineering. It became a national leader in educating women in engineering and in creating the first engineering PhD innovation program in the country to prepare doctoral candidates for entrepreneurial success. He is a co-recipient of the National Academy of Engineering's 2014 Bernard M. Gordon Prize for Innovation in Engineering and Technology Education for the design and implementation of Dartmouth's Engineering Entrepreneurship Program. So this also includes the PhD Innovation Program. He is also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. As you all may know, he is a chemical engineer by formal training with a PhD from MIT. So I'd like to bring to the stage Dr. Helble. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Wow, it's nice to be back. It's great to see all of you, see so many former colleagues and friends. As Teresa said in her very kind introduction, I was Dean of Engineering for a while at Dartmouth. In fact, I was Dean of Engineering from 2005 to 2018, a little over 13 years. And it was, if you had asked me when I started, and I say this to some of you who've been in your roles for 10 or 15, or there are a few of you here who've been in your roles for 20 years, if you'd asked me when I started if I could have imagined being in the role for more than a decade, I'm not sure I would have had an answer. But the engineering landscape has changed so much in the past 15 or 20 years that the role that we all play, the role that I was able to play as Dean of Engineering, I think became dramatically different. Part of what drove that was the substantial increase in enrollments that we've all seen. But part of what drove that, of course, is the demand for more hands-on learning, more active and engaged learning, and also the challenge to each of us to think about educating our students in different ways. So when Teresa asked me if I would return to EDI and speak a bit about our work at Dartmouth, and the work that around innovation and entrepreneurship that caused us to think about our approach to education a little bit differently, and it ultimately was recognized by the NAE with the Gordon Prize. I, of course, said I was happy to come back here, but I wanted to do that, and will do that in the next half hour or so, in the broader context, by looking at the landscape of engineering education and how it's shifted, how the numbers have changed, and how this has created both demand and challenge and opportunity for each of us. So what I'm going to do is walk through at a high level some of the program elements that we designed and devised around entrepreneurship and innovation, but I'm going to take most of my time to focus on what we did at the PhD program, because I think that is the area where, from my perspective, as a dean and from my perspective as a provost, the opportunity for innovation, the opportunity for challenge, the opportunity for change remains the greatest. And I'm hoping we might even have time for a little bit of discussion afterwards, because I know that many of you are similarly conducting experiments in your graduate programs, particularly in your PhD programs. And so, okay, let's try that again. There we go. So, as Teresa said in the introduction, the Gordon Prize was given to Dartmouth 4 years ago for creating an integrated program in engineering innovation from undergraduate through the doctorate to prepare students for technology leadership, for engineering leadership. This program was developed and this award was given in the context, as I said, of significant national conversation around the need to bring about change in engineering education and in the academy. The 4 images I have shown here are reports that most, if not all of us, are familiar with, from the Council on Competitiveness report in 2004 on Innovate America, the needs to think about innovation and entrepreneurship in our educational system, to the very prominent and often cited by the group of us National Academies reports, all of which cited a critical need for funding in engineering and in the STEM fields. All of us cited a critical need for supporting education, and which ultimately led to the development of the America Competes Act and the beginnings of a path towards investing significantly in funding at the National Science Foundation. It hasn't, of course, quite achieved the doubling that the Competes Act called for, but there was attention to an investment in NSF. Less noticed, but also clearly identified in these reports, was the need for better translation of the work our students do and of our faculty do out of the laboratories. In fact, there is a quote in the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report that says the goal is nothing less than to ensure that the United States remains the premier place in the world for innovation. In this broad context was the motivation for us and so many others for thinking much more deliberately and intentionally about programs in engineering entrepreneurship. Now, as I said in my comments at the beginning, the landscape has certainly changed. All of us are experiencing this on our campuses. All of us are seeing dramatic increases in undergraduate enrollments. These are data taken from the data that ASEE collects. Thank you, Gene Salento, for leading a discussion earlier this afternoon on data collection. And if we look at full-time undergraduate enrollments in engineering, and I've looked at 2003, 8, 13, and then the most recent data that were available when I put the slides together, data for 2017, we see that 15 years ago, when I first became Dean of Engineering, enrollments were growing just a few percent annually. And in fact, there was 7% growth over the 5-year period from 2003 to 2008. Those of us who have been around a long time will remember that there was, in fact, national conversation at that point in time around the need to encourage more students to study engineering, because there was a concern that we were falling behind in globally competitive industries because we weren't producing enough engineers. After 2008, we saw explosive growth begin in undergraduate enrollments. In fact, there's been 54% growth over the past decade, although I will note, if you look carefully at the ASEE data, that the numbers have been relatively flat the past few years. If you look at bachelor's degrees that have been granted last year, the ASEE tally was just short of 125,000. Staggering if you think a decade ago we were in the 60 to 70,000 range. We exceeded 100,000 for the first time just 3 years ago, and the numbers look as if they're going to continue to rise at a slower rate, but continue to rise. More engineering students, more interesting projects, more technology being developed. And so the question for all of us is, what are we doing to help those students think about what you do with the technology beyond developing it in the laboratory? So the recognition we received from the NAE was around this notion of an integrated program in innovation and entrepreneurship. I'm going to take just a few minutes to touch on some of the things we have done at the undergraduate level. And then, as I said, I want to spend the balance of my time speaking about what we do with our PhD students and how that was particularly differentiating for us. First, let me give you a little bit of history. One slide in history, because Dartmouth is organized a little bit differently than most of your institutions. Although Dartmouth has been around for, in fact, the university is celebrating its 250th anniversary this year, founded in 1769, so it's the 8th oldest institution of higher learning in the country. The engineering school was founded about a century later in 1867. It was actually founded with an endowment, so it is certainly one of the earliest endowed and named schools of engineering in the country. The board was named, but it took the board 4 years to hire the first dean. I think the person they eventually hired, Robert Fletcher, was something like the 11th or 12th or 13th choice, and so the interview process was rigorous and slow-moving, but 4 years after the endowment, before they had the first dean and professor and were able to begin instruction. But the thing that's relevant here is that from the very beginning, this is an engineering school that was conceived as something that was done, or an engineering education that was provided to students after they completed 3 years of their liberal arts education at Dartmouth or elsewhere. And so the students were educated broadly in the liberal arts from the very beginning. For the past 60 years, there have in fact been no engineering departments and no disciplinary degrees. Although Dartmouth started its engineering program as a school of civil engineering that later added electrical and mechanical engineering, in 1958, it became the first, and it may well be the only, certainly Research One university in the country that requires all of its engineering students to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree before they get the ABET accredited degree. And so that's been something that's been in place for 60 years. We tell students it is a 5-year, 2 bachelor's degree program. Now that's relevant here not so much for the details, but because of some of the program elements it enabled us to put in place that I'll touch on briefly. It's a foundation that has all students, regardless of engineering discipline or interest, in the same classroom from the beginning. So students who are aspiring mechanical engineers, chemical engineers, electrical, biomedical are taking project classes from the beginning, which enables us to challenge the students with pretty broad interdisciplinary project-based learning from the get-go. The first class that students take as undergraduate engineering students is a projects-based class, similar to projects-based classes that many of us in this room have. But what's different, again, is that all of the students, regardless of engineering discipline, are in the same class at the same time. The class has a fairly prosaic name. It's called Introduction to Engineering, but it's really a guided exercise through the design, development, prototyping, and even patent writing process. And this is what students are challenged with in either their first or second year as freshmen or sophomores, to engage their interest in engineering, but also to show them that engineering is meant to be a creative exercise. You're not solving the textbook problems, you're solving problems of your own choosing. So the faculty simply identify a very broad theme and give the students guidance, but a considerable amount of latitude. Students choose the problem that they want to solve. They go through this design process over the course of a 10-week term. They are reviewed by a review board. So they are not only writing reports for their faculty, but they're reviewed by a review board. And I will say as a parenthetical note here, although I'm not going to speak about the gender demographics in the engineering program at Dartmouth, one of the things we began doing about a decade ago very deliberately was making sure that the teaching assistants and the review board were close to gender parity, so that all of our students from the beginning, male and female, were learning from and being mentored by talented men and women, peers a few years older, as well as professional engineers, to create this norm that the engineering community should be a diverse and talented community. And we've seen over the course of that period of time the gender demographic in the engineering program itself change considerably. At any rate, this class challenges students to go on not only in the design process, but to learn how to create a patent. They're supported if they choose to go on beyond this course, and they do some pretty interesting and incredible things. The themes, as I said, are intentionally broad to help foster creativity. Some of the themes are listed here. The students are just challenged to find a problem that will result in saving water. Find a problem that is the application of engineering to healthcare and medicine. Find a problem that will help the users or the community save time. A personal favorite, identify a problem that will help improve the quality of life in winter. A challenge that most of you don't face, but I got an email from one of my colleagues this morning that showed it had snowed on the Dartmouth Green last night. Here it is, the middle of April. This is Mother Nature's joke that's played with us every year around this time. Right. The students are engaged in a fully fully coached and engaged environment. This is a session from the class where we have faculty, professional staff, and teaching assistants supporting the students as well, and they do some pretty incredible things. This approach, this design and project-based focus, this focus on teaching students how to think about doing something like writing an intellectual property disclosure from the time they're freshmen or sophomores, is an approach that's carried all the way through their undergraduate education into several other design classes, including their BE capstone design project. Here, the projects are not ones that students come up with themselves. They are suggested by outside entities, but the focus on translation that the students have carried with them all the way through leads to some pretty interesting outcomes. This is just one project I'm showing you from 4 years ago. This is an interesting one because it was eventually commercialized by the students who worked on the project. Their first job was creating their own job. They've developed mobile robotic tackling dummies. They were able to spend an evening with Stephen Colbert on The Late Show, having him don a point of pride for the institution, don a Dartmouth football helmet and tackle the senior capstone design project on the stage. It is now in use by more than half of the National Football League teams. This is a project that came out of an undergraduate program that was emphasizing innovation and entrepreneurship around project-based learning all the way through. The Gordon Prize recognized a second element that's at the master's level. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend much time talking about that, other than to say that from the late 1980s, we have had an integrated partnership program, a professional master's program in engineering management with the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. It's a 15-month curriculum that combines engineering and business. The students take advanced engineering classes. They take classes in optimization, data analytics. They can take mechanical and chemical engineering graduate classes as well. But they also take courses that forge the bridge between engineering and business. A required course, for example, is one in technology assessment, where the students are essentially given technology-based problems to study and then asked to address the question, if you were the CEO, would you invest in this technology? Is it ready, or choose an alternative? Students identify different areas of study to focus on. One of them, very deliberately, is around entrepreneurship. And long story short, over the 30-year history of this program, we have found that students who pass through this tend to be extraordinarily entrepreneurial. And in fact, our surveys of alumni have suggested consistently that after roughly the 10-year mark, 1 in 4 of them have founded their own firm, which is, again, this is a business-focused master's program, but it's much higher than that for our MS students in comparison. All right, let me finish by, as I said, spending the balance of my time speaking about the challenge at the PhD level and what we've tried to do to create a new pathway for PhD students. This is a much more recent development. This is a program that's a little bit over 10 years old, and it was done again in this broader context, the broader challenge that these reports have laid out, asking us collectively to think about changes that we might bring about in engineering education. All right, so same set of reports challenge us to provide more translational outlets for our students. We've responded nationally in so many different ways. Many of us, many of us, have experimented at the undergraduate level in the ways that I've just described we've done at Dartmouth. That is by no means unique. There are opportunities like accelerators, certainly Y Combinator being the most famous, that have been set up over the past 10, 15, 20 years to help nurture young technology entrepreneurs. There are state partnerships with universities to help foster commercialization. The U-Star example that Rich Brown speaks about often to this group, the University of Utah partnership, is exemplary. Many of the universities have set up incubators to help commercialize the work that faculty and students have developed. And even the federal government, through the establishment of the I-Corps program some 7 or 8 years ago, has recognized the importance of providing additional funding to help commercialize the results of the technology and the research that it invests in. But all of these presume that you have intellectual property, you have a technology, even a company. And the question we asked ourselves is, what about the students? What about the student who's coming into a PhD program, has a general sense that they may not want to pursue the path that we pursued. They may not want to be an academic, and they may not want to go work for a large company, but they really don't know what other options are out there. There's certainly more and more of these students crossing our doors. If you look at national doctoral enrollments, these again are the most recent ASEE data, you can see the steady growth in PhD enrollments, and in fact, PhD enrollments have grown 34% over the past decade. PhD degrees granted in engineering have roughly kept pace. We're up to just about 12,000 PhDs in engineering granted annually in this country every year. What about faculty positions, right? Have the faculty numbers kept pace with the growth in undergraduates that we need to serve? I think all of you reflexively and instinctively know the answer to that is a resounding no. Have they kept pace with the growth in PhD students? I apologize that the order here is flipped, and so this is going from most recent on your left to a decade ago on your right. But if you look at the growth in faculty numbers, at first glance it looks as if faculty numbers have been growing, but in fact, over the past decade, tenure-track faculty growth in engineering in this country is only up 18%, right? So roughly a couple of percent a year. Almost all of the growth has been in non-tenure track faculty, over a doubling of the numbers of non-tenure track faculty employed by the group of us over the past decade. And in fact, if you look at the number of PhDs that are being granted, if you look at the number of assistant professors who ASEE reports being employed as tenure-track assistant professors in this country, and if you make an estimate of the number of years, the length of time an individual is a tenure-track assistant professor before either being promoted to an associate professor or being denied tenure and moving on, you can come up with a reasonable estimate of the number of assistant professor openings in engineering and tenure-track positions in this country on an annual basis. And the number's about 1,100 to 1,200 by my estimate. 1,100 to 1,200 says that even with the growth in tenure-track openings, it's roughly 1 in 10 of our engineering PhD students who are moving on to tenure-track faculty positions. 90% of them are doing something completely different. And so if you step back and think about how our programs are designed, we have programs that work exceptionally well to train researchers. We teach them fundamentals in the discipline, we challenge them and examine them based on their undergraduate and their graduate education. We give them coursework that's designed to support their research project, and we ask them to deeply explore an original research question, much in the same way our colleagues in the sciences educate their students. Although this is changing over time, I would argue that many of us, other than assigning students as TAs, don't pay a whole lot of attention to teaching them to teach. We don't pay a lot of attention to giving them the breadth plus the depth that's valued by industry, and we don't do a lot to teach them the educational elements of building an organization and think about becoming technology entrepreneurs. And this is against a backdrop where the data suggests that less than 1 in 4 of engineering PhDs end up working at universities, and that's declining. I didn't show those data, but that comes from the NSF survey of graduate programs and university employment. 1 in 10 engineering PhDs obtain tenure-track positions. That's the data that I just showed you. And if you think about the number who obtain positions at one of 131 Carnegie R1 institutions, the Research 1 very high research activity institutions, which is largely what the PhD research programs are designed to prepare them for, it's far less than 1 in 10. And so in this context, we saw an opportunity for ourselves to build on what we did at the undergraduate level and provide elements of structured thinking around innovation, structured thinking around enterprise and company creation, structured thinking around entrepreneurship, building that deliberately and intentionally into a track in the PhD program. We set it up initially as a very limited program, limiting it to no more than 5 new students a year. We wanted it to be selective from the beginning, so we set up a separate admissions process that included asking engineering PhD students to write essays about their interests in potentially commercializing technology, and we had an in-person or Skype interview. We set up a system, and I'll touch on this in a minute, that had coursework that went beyond the core PhD. We asked them as part of their study to write a business plan, and we also told them if you enter this program, we're going to give you the opportunity, in fact, you will be required to step away from your PhD studies for 3 to 6 months late in the tenure of your PhD and do an internship either pursuing your own idea or at a company, preferably a startup, working in the broad area of technology that you're trying to develop. And so as you might imagine, getting to this point had involved many interesting conversations with the faculty, because this is a choice that we were making to give some of our most productive PhD students the opportunity, in fact, to step out of the lab for 3 to 6 months in their last 1 to 2 years of their PhD program. But there was a collective sense that this was an opportunity worth pursuing, that it might bring a different kind of PhD student to our program. It would certainly give our PhD students a different outlet for their interests. So we built a curriculum that looks substantially different. I won't go through the details, but you could see on the left you have the regular PhD course requirements. Students have the normal mix of technical depth. We require some math proficiency, and then breadth in another technical area related to the work that they're doing. We adjusted those requirements and expanded them for the students who were in the PhD innovation program. So they are designed to take a class, or required to take a class, that teaches them how to file for patent protection, how to raise financing, how to build an organization. They are required to take a class where they build a business plan around their own idea. They are required to take classes in finance and in patent law, and they are required to do this internship. We're able to do this, if the slide changes, by finding a way to fund part of the program differently. And so these students have what we call reverse fellowships. They're not funded by the university their first 2 years in the PhD program. They're funded by the university the last 3 years of their program. They're funded by their advisor the first 2 years, which requires that they join active, well-funded labs. They may or may not write a master's thesis at the end of that 2 years, but they do most of their coursework. They begin making inroads in their research problem, and then in year 3, they receive funding directly from the institution. The funding goes to the student rather than the faculty member, and that's intentional to give the student the flexibility to take the project they were working on in what might be a slightly orthogonal direction. They receive the usual kind of support plus a budget for supplies. And so to do this, of course, required a fair amount of funding had to be raised. As a private institution, we have a group of supportive alumni who were willing to take a chance and support this idea in the mid to late 2000s. But we diverted some additional internal resource to do it, and we found very quickly was that we were able to get foundation support for it. We were able to use this and leverage it to get funding from NSF for an I-Chords node more recently. So there are 100 of these around the country, and we were fortunate to have one of them to help support the students in this program. We've been able to subsequently attract NIH funding, and we now have interest across the campus. In a rare case of faculty in the sciences looking to engineering and saying, we'd like to partner with you, this program is now going to be available to students and faculty in the sciences this year going forward. And so it's been a remarkable transformation for our PhD program and the students who go through it. If we take a quick look at the outcomes for the students who've gone down this path versus those in our traditional PhD program, we see that over the first 5 years of the program, they were more than 3 times more likely to file intellectual property protection. They were 5 times less likely to pursue a postdoc, and in fact, these numbers have since gone down. Very few of these students are pursuing a postdoc, and they are much more likely to either start their own venture or join a startup after graduation, as opposed to postdoc, university position, or joining a large organization. 10 years in now, we've hired an academic entrepreneur to our faculty to guide the program. We've reached the point where more than half of our faculty have mentored students in this program. We've gotten some nice external recognition for providing a new path for the PhD. And our early graduates of this program to our more recent graduates of this program are finding that they are getting the opportunity to do things that they could not have imagined possible when they entered a PhD program. One thing I will say that I don't have on a slide, but has been interesting for us, is now 10 years in, if you look at the quality of PhD applicants to our program, the strongest applicants in terms of undergraduate performance are the ones who are coming specifically for this program. All right? Now, around this, of course, it's not sufficient to just build a program in isolation. We began to talk about this as a core element of our approach to engineering education. I won't claim that we're the only ones doing this by any stretch, but I felt it was important in the early years of this program that we signal to the students and to the external community that this is something that we valued in engineering students, this notion of intellectual property creation, of innovation and entrepreneurship being something that we felt distinguishes engineering amongst the sciences. We said very openly that we believe this is what society expects of us as engineers when they invest in our colleges and universities. So we put up a patent wall. We have an annual ceremony to recognize faculty and students whose work has received a domestic patent for work that they've done in the engineering school. We celebrate faculty who are technology entrepreneurs, and in fact, over the course of the past decade, our faculty have transitioned to the point where now more than 40% of them have started a company in the past decade. And we are seeing faculty who I never imagined thinking about application for their work in this way, partnering with some of the supporters of this program and partnering with our PhD students who have gone through this program to take their work in a new direction. So let me simply stop here. I'll make a few general comments and then stop and see if there are any questions, by saying that we have also seen this different take on our PhD program help diversify our pool of PhD students in ways that I did not anticipate. In the very first year of the program, all of our applicants to the PhD program were male, to the Innovation PhD program. All of them were male, and only one of them was non-white. So we stepped back and started interviewing our undergraduate students who were working at some of the other elements of our program to ask them why they weren't applying to our PhD innovation program. We surveyed some of the outside students who were applying to our PhD program, and we heard pretty clearly and directly that something that surprised me, they didn't see this as a path for them. And so that was an eye-opener for us. And so we worked hard on changing the senior faculty who were engaged in the program. We were able to get some support from the Luce Foundation that enabled us to give lucrative fellowships to the first 2 female participants in the program. And over time, we have, of course, seen that build on itself to the point where the program is now over 40% female. 70% of the students are domestic, but the international students are the most diverse group of international students in our overall PhD program. Right. And so let me simply close by saying this was our particular approach to addressing both an opportunity and a challenge. The challenge being the fact that we had not seen in our own program or nationally much change in our model of PhD education over decades. And yet we had seen students looking for a different path through the academy and numbers suggesting that very few of them were going to end up in tenure-track faculty positions. Just a few years ago, Science actually did a study or reported the results of several studies on this question and found that while only a small fraction of PhD students in the science and engineering said they were interested in founding their own company, nearly half of them said that they were entering their PhD studies interested in joining a startup organization. They had tolerance for risk, but what mostly motivated them was the potential autonomy of a startup and the desire to see the work that they pursued as graduate students translated into something that helped improve the human condition, something that benefited people beyond being a publication on the shelf. Interestingly, if you see the clever graphic in the middle of the green there, the dollar sign, students overwhelmingly said potential for financial gain was not a primary motivation. Right? We've seen broad support for this kind of work develop nationally. I mentioned the I-Corps program. Those of you who are not members, the next RFP is due out mid-2019, 9 nodes and 100 sites nationally. This program has been a huge help to us in helping support students as they move down this path. We've also seen, over the course of the decade, many, many more institutions beginning to ask interesting questions about what additional opportunity we could all collectively provide our PhD students. There's an increasing number of certificate and minor programs, and there are even some institutions that have built a track into the PhD program itself. And so let me end here by saying, for me, this is one of the things that's most exciting about the work that we're doing collectively. This opportunity, this moment to rethink what it means to be an engineering PhD, not in any way to detract from the core of the scientific and technological research our students do, but to give them the opportunity to envision careers that are very different than the ones that we chose. Yes, the 10% will still pursue academic careers and will support that, but for the 90% who are going to end up doing something different, we have a way to show them from the time they are students that they can build skills as university PhD students to take their science, their technology, their engineering knowledge in new and different directions. So let me stop there, say thank you for inviting me to come back with you. As I said, it's always good to be back with old colleagues and friends, long-time colleagues and friends. All right, thanks very much. Mm-hmm.
And I've just been asked by my chancellor to develop one of these, so I'm very in tune with these ideas. First and foremost, the idea is that we're not educating people to go into academic research, but we want to have practitioners. Maybe you have a little bit more focus on the entrepreneurship part, but there's a lot of parallels there. So I wonder whether you have any comments on these. I mean, for instance, your students, do they do research work and write a research thesis?
They do, and so they still write a thesis. They are still required to publish a paper in the open literature. We track this closely because one of the concerns of some members of our faculty in the beginning was students would file a couple of intellectual property disclosures. The publication rate would go down. That would impact the faculty member's career. We'd have less of the traditional output. They are still required to publish papers, and in fact, we've not seen that happen. Their publication rate, on average, is the same, maybe a little less, but close to the same as the students. We have a control group, the students who don't go through this program. In terms of, you're absolutely right that this program shares some elements of the applied PhD program of the type you're describing. For me personally, I say this as a provost, but also as the engineering dean, I'm enormously supportive of a broad range of different kinds of pathways. Pathways that will prepare engineering PhD students for public service, pathways that will prepare engineering PhD students for focusing on being teachers, pathways that will prepare engineering PhD students for applied careers in industry or for being entrepreneurs. And to do any of that, I think we should be asking ourselves, why can't we think about changing the coursework? Why can't we change, as long as they're doing some original research, why don't we change the structure and goals of the PhD? Yeah.
Hold on there.
So I was just wondering what maybe two or three of the things that maybe were a little harder than you had anticipated and what you had to sort of pivot on or change because you thought it would go A and it went B, and so you had to sort of think about it a little bit.
That's an interesting question. Things that we had to pivot or change. We've changed the curriculum a bit over time. We've changed the funding model over time. So it was very structured, and the way I describe it was very structured, 2 years and then 3 years or 3+ the university would support. It's now a blended model so that students can start working on their own idea a little bit sooner with the support of their advisor. That's something I didn't anticipate, and there were some problems with the handoff and the transition that helped solve. The coursework has evolved. We relied more on the business school in the early years, and we've decided we have business school faculty involved, but we've restructured the curriculum so it's much more focused on technology rather than general business school. How do you think about entrepreneurship coursework? So those weren't major changes. Actually, I have to say the biggest one that was an eye-opener for me is the one I mentioned for many of us. The first year, we didn't have a huge number of applications the first year, maybe 20, but the fact that there were literally 0 female applicants really caused us at the end of that first year to ask how we were presenting the program, who was involved in the program, what images we were using to describe the program, and really work very intentionally on that. We didn't think we would have to. That was clearly naive and wrong.
Joe, first off, congratulations on what sounds like a terrific and imaginative program. It sounded really good. I wanted to ask how much the program costs per student currently.
Well, it costs, well, so per student it costs what stipend and, so whatever our stipend is, plus, high 20s or something like that, plus medical insurance, plus $10,000 a year. So it's the nominal $50,000 to $60,000 per year per student.
That's including
in the program.
Administrative costs and so on, or?
Oh, administrative costs. Well,
No, I'm just, so trying to see what this actually comes out to be.
it is considered a major committee assignment for a faculty member, right? So it's overseen in that way.
And in terms of your, the internships that they're doing, do you set them up with the startups, or do they do it themselves? Do they end up in faculty startups of various kinds out in Dartmouth, or?
All of the above. And so we actually tell the students from the get-go, the onus is on you, right? If you're thinking about going down an entrepreneurial pathway, you're going to have to do a lot of the groundwork here. We provide support, we make introductions, we answer questions. But it's not as though we have a group of the faculty who've started companies who will say, if you don't find a job, I will take you for 3 to 6 months. It's really individualized. Now, it's one of the things that as the program gets larger, so now that we're working with the medical school, I didn't touch on it, but we've got NIH-funded surgical innovation track fellows who are working on problems related to surgery. And we expand to the broader university, the numbers of students in the program are going up. It's going to be more challenging to give the kind of individualized attention to that question specifically that we've been giving. So I don't have an answer as to how we're going to manage it 3 or 4 years down the road, but now it's largely on the students.
Hi, it's great program. So you started, I guess, from the premise that 1 out of 10 students only goes to academia and we really educate them this way, our PhDs. And so let's say another 1 out of 10 becomes a startup entrepreneur. Is the program really geared towards them only, or do you also sort of educate them to go for careers in industry? And if so, was there any engagement with the industry, sort of iterative process, asking industry what they needed?
So we've had a few students who have done their internship at 3M, IBM, Google, and I can't characterize any of them as startups. And so if the student really wants to go in that direction, we certainly support them and allow them to. And I flashed past it quickly at the end, but one of the things that we have said all along is the goal is not actually we expect the natural outcome will be that the students will go down an entrepreneurial pathway in disproportionate numbers relative to our control group of normal PhD students. We do not by any stretch expect that to be the path that every student in that program will take. And so it's a different kind of education that's more applied. We tell them the goal is to enable you to think about the use of your PhD in different ways, and what you do with it is up to you.
My question is kind of touching on a previous question here, but has IP been an issue if faculty and students are involved? Sometimes the university and faculty and students have different views on who owns the IP, so I'm not sure if you have any insight to share there.
I have worse stories to share. I don't know if I have insight to share. Mostly it's not been an issue. We were very clear in the beginning that, of course, if federal funding's involved and they're advisors of PI on the grant that's partially supporting the work they're doing, it's clear what the path to ownership is. We have said that if the students are doing something, this was by agreement of the faculty, if the students are doing something supported by the stipend they're getting from the school and the $10,000 of research funding that they get, that's clearly gone in an orthogonal direction, they own it. We allow them to own it. There have been, in 11 years now, there has been one case of one patent where it took us a while to address it, quite honestly, because the faculty advisor and the student had different perspectives on relative contribution. I would like to say that will never happen again, but I suspect it will. But it was ultimately resolved. It's just the kind of thing you need to work through. Thank you all. My timer says that I'm out of time. I can't see any of you, but thanks very much. Thanks very much for the questions.